They thought the house was empty. But behind its rotting walls, a frightened little girl hid with nothing but a torn teddy bear. And the only one who found her wasn't a cop or a neighbor, it was his German shepherd, Rex, a veteran officer trained to face danger, now standing before the most important mission of his life, saving a child who called him Dad for the first time. What happened next will shatter your heart and piece it back together again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe in second chances, if you believe every child deserves safety and love, hit that subscribe button, because this story will stay with you forever. The first snow of late November had come early to Mountain Hollow, a small Montana town nestled between two ridges of pine-covered mountains. The air smelled of wood smoke and frost, the kind of cold that bit through gloves and settled deep in the bones. The streets were quiet now, only the muffled crunch of tires on snow breaking the stillness. Outside the town's limits, the land opened into long, windswept fields where fences leaned with age and barns slouched under the weight of years. It was here, on a forgotten gravel road nearly claimed by weeds, that Caleb Hayes steered his pickup truck toward a weathered mailbox that still bore a name in faded paint. Caleb, at 38, had the kind of build that came from a life of real work, broad-shouldered, tall, with a square jaw shadowed by salt and pepper stubble. His eyes, a steady gray blue, carried the kind of calm that only comes from seeing both the worst and best of people. He had been a deputy in Mountain Hollow for a decade, but before that, he'd served overseas in the Army Military Police. His friends described him as steady, fair, and stubborn to a fault, but the truth was that much of that steadiness had been forged in loss. His mother, Margaret Hayes, had been diagnosed with heart failure the year before, and he had dreamed of bringing her here to the countryside, away from the noise, to breathe cleaner air and live out her last years in peace. But she'd passed away just 2 weeks before the papers for this property were signed. The irony stung like the winter wind. Sitting in the passenger seat was Rex, his 9-year-old German shepherd, a dog whose black and tan coat was peppered with gray around the muzzle and marked by a faint scar along his right ribs. Rex was not just a partner, but a survivor. Caleb had first met him during his last deployment. Rex had been a military working dog, trained for search, rescue, and protection. On one mission, an explosion had torn through the compound they were patrolling, and Rex had dragged Caleb half-conscious from the blast into cover. When the military retired Rex due to his injuries, Caleb couldn't let him go to anyone else. "You saved my life, pal," Caleb had whispered that day, resting a hand on the dog's neck. "Guess I'll spend the rest of mine watching your back. We're in this together, Rex." The name had come naturally short, strong, and loyal, just like the dog. The tires crunched to a stop in front of the farmhouse. The place was a picture of abandonment. Roof tiles mottled with moss, porch sagging under the weight of snow, windows clouded and warped. A large oak tree loomed near the house, its bare branches rattling in the wind like old bones. Caleb stepped out, boots sinking into a thin crust of snow. The cold gnawed instantly at his ears. He tugged his jacket tighter, adjusting the brim of his patrol cap. "Well, Rex," he murmured, "home sweet fixer-upper." The dog hopped down, nose immediately twitching, tail low, but alert. Caleb had been warned that the property had been abandoned for years, yet as they stepped onto the porch, he felt something in the air, a faint warmth, as if the place wasn't entirely empty. The key turned reluctantly in the lock, the door creaking on rusted hinges. Inside, the smell of dust and old wood hit first, followed by the sight of a front room that time had not been kind to. A threadbare couch sat under a window, its cushions sagging. Faded curtains hung stiff with age. Caleb took a step inside, the floor groaning under his weight. Rex followed, his nails clicking softly on the boards. Suddenly, the dog froze, head lifted, ears swiveling. Caleb knew that look Rex had caught a scent. Without warning, the shepherd padded swiftly down the hallway, then up the narrow staircase at the end. "Rex!" Caleb called, hurrying after him. The attic door at the top was cracked open, a thin sliver of light spilling into the hall. Rex pushed it wider with his nose and slipped inside. When Caleb reached the doorway, he saw the dog sitting perfectly still, his body forming a silent barrier in front of a dark corner. It was there, curled up against the wall, that he saw her. A little girl, no older than 9, with tangled blonde hair and a face pale from cold, clutching a torn teddy bear to her chest. Her knees were drawn up under an oversized sweater, and in her lap lay a folded piece of paper, a birth certificate. Caleb's heart jolted when he saw his own. The girl's eyes were wide, both fearful and searching. Rex stayed beside her, tail curled around his paws, posture protective but calm. Slowly, Caleb crouched, removing his cap. "Hey, sweetheart. My name's Caleb. This is Rex. We didn't mean to scare you." The girl's gaze darted between him and the dog, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "You're my dad, aren't you?" Caleb felt the cold air leave his lungs. His voice faltered, his mind scrambling. He had never seen her before, never been told she existed, and yet here she was, huddled in the attic of the house he had just bought for $1, holding proof that she was his child. Outside, the wind howled against the siding, but inside, time seemed to hold still. The attic was warmer than Caleb expected, though not by much. The single window, half fogged from the cold outside, let in a muted light that fell across Lily's small frame. She hadn't moved since whispering those impossible words. "You're my dad, aren't you?" Rex lay beside her now, his body curved like a shield, his head resting on his paws, but his amber eyes fixed on her every movement. Caleb crouched a few feet away, resting his forearms on his knees, trying not to crowd her. "Lily, right?" She nodded, barely more than a tremor. "Where's your mom?" he asked gently. Her eyes darted down to the teddy bear she was clutching. "Mama's gone." The way she said it, not dead, not passed away, just gone, made his chest tighten. "Who's been looking after you?" A pause. "Miss Mara?" The name came out thin, almost like she was afraid the walls would hear it. "She told me to stay here, not to go outside, not to talk to anyone, not to go to school. She said, I shouldn't bother people." Caleb's brows furrowed. "How long have you been here alone?" Lily shrugged, but her voice was small. Since she stopped waking up. Miss Mara came, took her away, said she was going to the hospital. Then she came back without her, told me to be a good girl and stay here, or—" She trailed off, her knuckles whitening on the teddy bear. Caleb felt the muscles in his jaw clench. Rex shifted closer to Lily, lowering his head so her small hand could rest on his fur. She hesitated, then slowly leaned against him, the first crack in her guarded posture. "He's warm," she murmured, almost to herself. Caleb tried to keep his voice calm. "Lily, do you know who I am?" She looked at him, eyes uncertain but searching. "Mama told me once, a long time ago, that my daddy's name was Caleb Hayes. But Miss Mara said he went away forever, that he didn't care. She told me not to think about him." The words hit harder than he expected because for a fleeting second he almost believed them. "Lily, I didn't know you existed," he said, his voice low but steady. "No one told me. Your mom, Caroline, we knew each other a long time ago. He stopped, the memories flooding in without permission. He saw Caroline as she'd been at 17, standing barefoot in the grass by the lake, her laugh carrying over the water. She had been quick to smile, quick to trust, and utterly unafraid of the world. Until the summer he enlisted. They'd promised to write, and at first they did. Then, 2 months into his first deployment, her letters stopped. He'd written anyway, sent postcards from bases and outposts, but none were answered. Eventually, he'd been told she'd moved away, that she didn't want to wait for him. He believed it, maybe because it was easier than believing something had gone wrong. Now, looking at the girl in front of him, the curve of her cheek and the stubborn tilt of her chin so much like Caroline's, he knew the truth was far more complicated. "Your mama and we cared about each other. I didn't leave because I wanted to," he said. "I didn't know she was sick. I didn't know I had you." Lily blinked at him, as if weighing whether to believe him. "Miss Mara said Mama was weak, that good people don't last in this world. She said you'd forget us." Caleb's stomach churned. He glanced at Rex, who had lifted his head, watching him with quiet intensity, as though sensing the storm brewing in his mind. "Miss Mara, is she family?" Caleb asked. Lily nodded. "Mama said she was her cousin. She came a lot when Mama started coughing." That word again, coughing. Caleb's mind began to piece together a picture he didn't like. Lily, when your mama was sick, did she ever try to send me a message? She frowned, thinking. One night Mama was crying. She had an envelope in her hand. But when Miss Mara came in, she hid it under her pillow. Later, it was gone. Caleb's throat tightened. He'd been away, working cases, pulling shifts, living a life built on the assumption that the past was buried. And all the while his daughter had been growing up without him, not by accident, but because someone had made sure of it. He forced himself to breathe slowly, not to let his anger show. Do you have any other family? He asked. No, Lily said simply. Just Mama. And now? You? Her voice wavered on the last word, as if she didn't quite dare to hope. Caleb nodded once, firmly. Yeah. Now me. He stood, holding out his hand. Come on, let's get you out of this attic. It's cold. Lily hesitated, then slid her small fingers into his. Rex stood as well, pacing beside them as Caleb led her down the narrow stairs. The rest of the house was no warmer. The front room still smelled of dust. But as they moved through, Caleb noticed details that stopped him in his tracks. The floral curtains in the kitchen, identical to the ones Caroline's mother used to sew. The hand-painted mug on the counter with C brushed in fading blue. A photograph frame on the mantel turned face down. He picked it up and turned it over. Caroline. Years older than the girl in his memory, her face thinner, but her eyes the same. She was standing in front of this very house, one hand resting on her belly. His stomach dropped. Lily was tugging at Rex's collar now, her voice soft. Miss Mara says people don't care, but I think maybe she's wrong. Caleb swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. She's wrong, he said. Dead wrong. In the fading light, with snow drifting against the window panes, the three of them stood in the middle of the ruined living room. A man, a child, and a dog who had once pulled him from death. And Caleb knew, with a certainty that cut through every doubt, that whatever had happened here, whatever Mara Vincent had done, it was only the beginning of the fight. The morning light crept in pale and thin through the kitchen window, catching dust motes in the air. Caleb stood at the counter, pouring hot water over coffee grounds, watching the steam curl upward. The house still felt more like a stranger's than his own. Lily sat at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of cocoa, her gaze fixed on Rex, who lay at her feet with his head on her sneakers. Every so often she'd lean down to brush her fingers over his fur, and his tail would thump once, a quiet reassurance. Caleb was trying to piece together his next step when the faint crunch of boots on snow reached his ears. He turned toward the front window. An older woman was making her way up the porch steps, her gait deliberate but slowed by age. She was bundled in a thick wool coat the color of rust, a matching scarf wound twice around her neck, and a pair of sturdy boots. Her hair was pure white, cut short and practical, and her face was lined not just by years, but by expressions that had been lived in. Worry, laughter, stubborn resolve. This was Mrs. Lucy Weaver, the nearest neighbor, whose property bordered the north fence line. Caleb had seen her once before in town, exchanging polite nods, but they'd never spoken beyond that. Lucy had been widowed for nearly 15 years, raising 2 sons on her own. One had moved to the city, the other had died in a mining accident, a loss that had carved a permanent crease of sadness at the corner of her mouth. She had a reputation in Mountain Hollow for being both fiercely private and fiercely loyal, the kind of woman who didn't involve herself in gossip, but if she called you a friend, she'd stand at your side no matter the storm. Caleb opened the door before she knocked. "Morning, Mrs. Weaver," he greeted. "Caleb Hayes," she said, her voice warm but edged with something unreadable. "Mind if I come in? I think we ought to talk." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the kitchen. As she entered, her gaze swept the room, lingering on Lily. "Well," Lucy murmured softly, "you've found her." Lily straightened in her chair, wary. Rex lifted his head, eyes locked on Lucy, but remained lying down, sensing no threat. Caleb glanced between them. "You know her?" Lucy removed her gloves, tucking them into her coat pocket. "Of course I do. That's Lily, Caroline's little girl." She met Caleb's eyes, and for a moment the room seemed to tighten. "And yours?" Caleb felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "You're sure?" Lucy's expression softened. "I've known Caroline since she was no higher than my knee. When she told me about you, about the letters, the promises, I could see she meant every word. And when she got pregnant, she wanted to tell you, but Lucy hesitated, glancing at Lily before continuing. Things got complicated. Caleb pulled out a chair for her, and they sat. Lily stayed quiet, her small hand resting on Rex's neck. The dog shifted, placing himself between her and the table's edge, his presence steady and protective. Complicated how? Caleb asked. Lucy sighed. She kept writing to you, Caleb. I know because she showed me the letters before she mailed them. But after you deployed, they started coming back. Address unknown. No forwarding. She thought maybe you'd been moved to a classified location, so she kept trying. Then Miss Mara showed up. The name was like a draft under the door, cold and unwanted. Mara told Caroline she had a contact in the military who said you'd left, maybe even remarried. Caroline didn't believe her, but the letters, they never reached you. Mara offered to help with the pregnancy, said she'd take care of her. And Caroline, sick as she was even then, didn't see the trap. Caleb's mind flickered back to nights in the desert, hunched over a cot under a single bulb, writing her name over and over on envelopes that never saw the inside of her mailbox. The memory stung. She was sick even before Lily was born? A cough that wouldn't quit, Lucy said. The doctors in town thought it was just the mine dust. Her father worked there. But it got worse after Lily came. Still, she fought. And she told me, if the day ever came when you came back, she wanted Lily with you. Said you'd be a better father than she could ever hope to be, given her health. Lily's eyes lifted at that, surprise flickering in her gaze. Caleb reached out, resting his hand over hers. I wish I'd known, he said quietly. You couldn't have, Lucy replied firmly. Mara saw to that. She straightened in her chair. I came today because people in town will start talking now that you're back. Some of it won't be kind. You need to be ready for it. And you need to know Mara won't let this go easy. Caleb's eyes narrowed. I'm not letting her near Lily again. Good, Lucy said. She pushed back her chair, pulling her coat tight. I'll leave you to your day. But if you need someone to vouch for you, for Caroline's wishes, you know where I live. At the door, she paused, looking at Rex. Fine dog you've got there. Caroline liked shepherds, said they had honest eyes. Caleb watched her cross the yard, her figure growing smaller against the bright crust of snow until the pines swallowed her from view. Behind him, Lily whispered into Rex's fur, words too soft for him to hear, but the dog's tail gave a slow wag. Caleb turned back to the table, his mind a tangle of questions, anger, and a resolve that felt heavier than the badge on his chest. By mid-afternoon, the sun had sunk low enough to cast a soft amber light through the upstairs windows, turning the dust in the air into flecks of gold. Caleb had decided that if he was going to live here, he needed to start making the house feel like his own. The upstairs bedroom, once clearly the master, was the worst of it. The wallpaper, once pale blue, had curled away from the plaster in wide strips. A dresser sat against one wall, one leg propped up on a folded newspaper from 2016. He could still smell faint traces of perfume under the heavier scent of mildew, a ghost of Caroline's presence that tightened his chest every time it hit him. Lily had been trailing behind him for most of the day, carrying a small box of toys she'd rescued from the attic. Rex moved between them, never far from either. The shepherd's ears twitched constantly, alert to every creak of the house. Caleb was pulling an old trunk toward the doorway when Rex stopped near the bed and began sniffing the floorboards intently. What is it, boy? Caleb asked. Rex's nose pressed close to the wood, his tail giving a slow, deliberate wag, the way he did when he'd found something during a search operation. Then he started pawing lightly at the boards, claws clicking against the grain. Caleb crouched, running his hands over the floor. That's when he felt it. A faint, irregular seam between two planks. He fetched a screwdriver from his toolbox and worked the edge into the gap. The board lifted with a reluctant groan, revealing a shallow space beneath. Inside was a narrow wooden box, the kind a person would use for keepsakes rather than valuables. It was dark-stained and smooth with age, the brass latch slightly tarnished. Caleb's hands tightened on it as he set it on the bed and flipped it open. Lily stepped closer, curiosity pushing past her shyness. Inside lay several envelopes tied with a faded ribbon, a small leather-bound journal, and a folded sheaf of papers so creased they looked ready to crumble. Caleb recognized the handwriting immediately, Caroline's looping, deliberate script. His throat tightened as he untied the ribbon. The first envelope he opened was dated 5 years ago. "Caleb," it began, "if you are reading this, it means something has gone wrong. I have been coughing for months now, and the doctor says it may be more than just the dust. Mara insists she can help, but I don't trust her. There is a coldness in her eyes when she thinks I'm not looking. She talks about the farm as if it's hers already. I am too weak to fight her and care for Lily at the same time. If you come back, please, take Lily away from here. Keep her safe. She is braver than she knows, but she is still just a child." Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, the paper trembling in his hands. He could almost hear her voice, softer now, weighted with exhaustion. He set the letter aside and reached for the journal. The leather was worn smooth at the edges, the pages inside filled with neat lines of ink that had bled slightly over time. The entries painted a picture of a woman fighting to keep her world intact while her health slipped away. She described nights spent trying to teach Lily to read from old library books, mornings when she had to lie about feeling better so her daughter wouldn't worry, and repeated warnings about Mara. How she'd begun intercepting the mail, how she'd started talking to the bank without Caroline's consent. The folded sheaf of papers at the bottom of the box stopped him cold. They were copies of the property deed and guardianship forms, but altered. Caleb compared the signatures. Caroline's was shaky, the ink smudged as though she'd been coughing while she signed. His own name was nowhere on the documents where it should have been, replaced instead with blank spaces that allowed Mara to claim sole authority. He felt his jaw tighten. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the floor now, Rex beside her, one hand absently scratching behind the dog's ear. She looked up at him. "What's wrong?" Caleb forced his voice steady. "Your mom. She tried to protect you. She wanted me to find you." Lily hugged her teddy bear closer, leaning into Rex. The dog shifted, resting his chin on her lap. Caleb folded the documents carefully and placed them back in the box. He didn't know yet how Mara had pulled it off, the timing, the legal loopholes, but now he had proof that she'd been planning this for years. As he set the floorboard back into place, he thought of all the times in the service when Rex had led him to hidden caches, weapons, contraband, sometimes survivors. The dog had always known where to look, and today was no different. "Good work, Rex," he said quietly, running a hand down the shepherd's back. Rex's ears flicked back at the praise, his amber eyes catching the light. Caleb looked at Lily again, seeing the trust beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. "We're going to make this right," he told her, "no matter what it takes." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes. The house no longer felt entirely like an empty shell. It felt like a place holding secrets, and now, finally, the first of them was in his hands. The sky had taken on the flat, pale gray that signaled snow before nightfall. Caleb was out on the porch tightening a loose railing when the low growl of an engine carried over the crunch of snow. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, and watched as a silver luxury SUV turned off the main road and rolled slowly up the drive. The vehicle was immaculate save for streaks of dried mud along the wheel wells, the kind that clung after being driven on unpaved back roads. The engine purred to a stop in front of the house. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. Mara Vincent was in her late 30s but carried herself with the poise of someone used to being in control. She had shoulder-length dark blonde hair styled in soft waves, catching the dim light like threads of caramel. Her tailored wool coat, deep forest green, cinched at the waist, gave her an elegant silhouette. High-heeled leather boots sank slightly into the snow, but she didn't seem to notice the cold. Her expression was smooth, composed, but her eyes, a pale, calculating blue, held the kind of watchfulness that measured every movement, every word. "Caleb Hayes," she greeted, her voice warm in a way that felt deliberate. "It's been a long time." Caleb kept his stance steady. "Mara." "I heard you bought the place," she said, glancing up at the house as if assessing its worth. "I came to clarify a few things, and to see Lily." At the sound of her name, Lily, who had been standing just inside the doorway, instinctively stepped back. Rex, lounging on the porch, rose to his feet, body tense. He placed himself in front of Lily, his amber eyes locked on Mara, lips lifting just enough to show the edge of white teeth. The growl that rumbled in his chest was low but unmistakable. "Still have a dog, I see," Mara said lightly, though her gaze flicked uneasily toward Rex. "He's protective." He's earned the right to be, Caleb replied. What exactly are you here to clarify? Mara took a step closer, folding her gloved hands. This property, Caroline and I discussed arrangements before she passed. She was worried about the bank foreclosing. I stepped in to make sure that didn't happen. I've been handling things since. I assumed you'd understand. Caleb pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping the screen. The soft chime of the voice recorder filled the air before he slipped it back in. Go on. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the gesture, but she kept talking. It's complicated. Caroline didn't have much, no clear will, and her health was declining. She needed someone to make decisions. I did what I had to. It wasn't about taking anything from her. It was about keeping the farm safe. Safe, Caleb repeated, glancing past her to the SUV. So safe you left a 9-year-old alone in it. Mara's smile faltered. I checked in. I brought food. Lily's voice, small but firm, drifted from behind Rex. Sometimes you didn't come for days. Mara's head turned sharply toward her. Sweetheart, you must remember wrong. She remembers fine, Caleb cut in. While they spoke, Rex had moved silently toward the SUV, circling behind it. His nose traced along the bumper, then dipped near the wheel well. He paused at the rear door, sniffing intently. Caleb watched out of the corner of his eye as Rex gave a short, sharp huff, then moved to the other side. When he returned to Caleb's side, the shepherd's fur was dusted with flakes of dried mud, and a faint, sour smell clung to his muzzle, the telltale scent of spoiled food. Where exactly were you keeping this food you brought? Caleb asked. In the car, Mara replied. Caleb said, non-committal, but filed the detail away. Spoiled supplies and freezing weather meant they'd been there longer than she'd admit. Combined with the mud, it suggested trips far from town, and a lot of time when Lily had been left to fend for herself. Mara shifted her weight, glancing toward the road. Look, Caleb, you've been back, a week? You don't know how hard it was for Caroline at the end, or for me trying to help her. You can stand there with your badge and your dog and judge me, but I did what I thought was best. What was best, Caleb said evenly, would have been making sure Lily wasn't alone, sick and cold in an empty house. What was best would have been telling me I had a daughter. For the first time, a flicker of something cracked through Mara's composure, irritation, maybe even fear. She took a slow breath. I can see this isn't going to be a friendly conversation. I'll be in touch. She turned, her boots crunching over the snow, back to the SUV. Caleb didn't move until the vehicle backed down the drive and disappeared around the bend. Rex eased closer to Lily, who crouched to wrap her arms around his neck. Caleb stepped off the porch and walked to where the SUV had been, his boots finding the deep tread marks left behind. A faint trail of mud and leaked liquid marked the snow where the rear of the car had idled. When he came back, Lily was still holding on to Rex, her cheek pressed into his fur. She scares me, she whispered. Caleb rested a hand on her shoulder. She's not going to hurt you again. Not while I'm here. Above them, the first flakes of snow began to fall, the world quieting under the slow, steady drift. Inside the house, the recorder in Caleb's pocket still held every word Mara had said, and he intended to make sure someone else heard them too. The courthouse in Mountain Hollow wasn't grand, a 2-story brick building with a white portico and a clock that had stopped keeping time sometime in the 1980s. But today it felt heavy with importance. Inside, the air carried the smell of old wood polish and winter coats drying in the radiator heat. Caleb stood near the front, his broad frame in a dark suit instead of his deputy uniform, his badge left at home to avoid any hint of intimidation. Beside him sat Marcus Dean, his attorney, a man in his mid-40s with a lean build, neatly trimmed brown hair, and the calm, deliberate movements of someone who had spent years in courtrooms. Marcus had once served in the Army JAG Corps before moving into civilian law, and his reputation for precision and persistence had earned him Caleb's trust. At Caleb's feet, Rex lay with his front paws neatly crossed, his head up and ears forward. The shepherd wore his plain leather collar, no service vest, but his presence was unmistakable, watchful, steady, a living anchor in the tense air. Lily sat in the row directly behind Caleb, close enough for him to turn and meet her eyes. She wore a simple navy sweater and leggings, her hair brushed back into a tidy ponytail by Mrs. Lucy that morning. Even so, her hands fidgeted in her lap until Rex shifted and rested his head against her knee. She smiled faintly and scratched his ears. Judge Harold Ellison presided, a tall, silver-haired man in his early 60s with a face weathered more by Montana winters than court stress. Known for his measured patience and dislike of theatrics, he had served on the bench for over 2 decades and saw through most attempts at manipulation. The case today was formally a custody and guardianship hearing, but the undercurrent was far heavier. The truth of what had happened to Caroline, the question of whether Mara Vincent had crossed the line from questionable caretaker to something criminal. Marcus began by presenting the journal, letters, and Lily's birth certificate. Your Honor, these documents show clear intent from the late Caroline Thompson that her daughter be raised by her biological father, Caleb Hayes, Marcus said, handing them to the clerk. They also show a pattern of interference by Ms. Vincent, intercepted communication, altered property and guardianship documents, and prolonged periods where the child was left without adequate care. Mara sat at the opposing table, her posture impeccable in a tailored gray suit, blonde hair smooth and perfectly arranged. She had chosen a pair of pearl earrings and no other jewelry, projecting an image of restraint. Her attorney, Vincent Hale, mid-50s, stocky, with thinning black hair and an aggressive courtroom style, leaned toward her often, whispering strategy. Mara's expression remained calm, but Caleb had seen the flicker in her eyes when the journal was mentioned. When it was time for Lily to speak, Marcus approached her gently. Lily, can you tell the court what you want? The girl's voice trembled at first. I want to live with my dad. Why is that? She hesitated, glancing toward Caleb. Rex, sensing her nerves, stood and stepped closer, settling at her side with a soft exhale. She rested her hand on his head, her shoulders straightening a little. Because he's kind. He listens. He doesn't make me stay in the house all the time, and he doesn't make me feel scared. Her voice steadied. Miss Mara left me alone a lot, sometimes for days. I had to make my own fire and eat bread that was hard and old. Hale rose to object, but Judge Ellison held up a hand. Overruled. The witness may continue. Lily took a breath. Mama told me once that my dad's name was Caleb Hayes. She wanted me to know that. But Miss Mara said he didn't care, that he'd gone away forever. That wasn't true. Marcus nodded, thanking her, then turned to the bench. Your Honor, the child's testimony aligns with documented evidence and third-party accounts. Mrs. Lucy was called next. She walked to the stand slowly but with her head high. In a modest brown wool coat and sturdy shoes, she looked every bit the lifelong Montanan she was, practical, grounded, and unimpressed by pretension. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much to be swayed by smooth words. I was Caroline's neighbor for over 20 years, she began. In her last months, I saw her health failing. I also saw Mara start showing up more. Caroline kept writing letters to Caleb, but they never seemed to reach him. She asked me once if I thought he'd come back. I told her yes, because I knew him, but she cried that day, said Mara had a way of making her doubt. Lucy paused, her eyes on Mara. In the end, Caroline told me, if Caleb comes back, tell him I don't want to lose my child. Tell him Lily is my everything. Hale tried to press her on dates and specifics, but Lucy was steady, refusing to be rattled. I may not remember every day, but I remember the truth, she said. And the truth is, Caroline wanted Lily with her father. Caleb kept his face neutral, but inside he felt the mix of grief and resolve deepen. When the testimonies closed for the day, Judge Ellison didn't rule immediately, stating he would review the evidence thoroughly. Still, Caleb knew the tide had shifted. Lily had spoken her truth, Lucy had confirmed it, and Mara's polished facade had begun to crack under the weight of detail. As they left the courtroom, Lily walked with her hand resting lightly on Rex's back, his steady gait matching hers. The shepherd glanced up at her once, then forward again, as if he understood the day had been a battle, and that more were coming. The second day of the hearing began under a sky streaked with high, thin clouds, sunlight struggling to break through. Caleb arrived at the courthouse early, Rex pacing quietly at his side. Lily walked between them, her hand resting on the shepherd's back, as though drawing strength from his steady presence. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a subdued tension. Townsfolk had filled the gallery benches, some out of curiosity, others out of loyalty to the Hayes or Thompson families. Judge Harold Ellison entered promptly at 9, his expression unreadable as he took his seat. After brief procedural remarks, he addressed the room. Having reviewed the submitted evidence, including the journal and letters of Caroline Thompson, the altered property and guardianship documents, the testimony of Mrs. Lucy Weaver, and the statements from the child herself, this court finds sufficient cause to conclude that Mr. Caleb Hayes is the rightful custodial parent of Lily Thompson. There was a small but audible murmur in the gallery. Caleb felt Lily's grip tighten, then release as she let out a soft breath. The judge continued, his voice firm. Furthermore, the court finds probable cause to open a criminal investigation into Ms. Mara Vincent for the offenses of document forgery, breach of trust, and child endangerment through abandonment. Ms. Vincent, you will be remanded into custody pending formal charges. All eyes turned to Mara. She sat stiffly at the defense table, her face pale but composed, though the tightness around her mouth betrayed the strain. She rose slowly, her attorney Vincent Hale speaking in low, urgent tones, but the bailiff, Deputy Frank Walters, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a calm, deliberate demeanor, stepped forward. Frank had served in the county for over 25 years, his patience tested daily, but he had little tolerance for those who hurt children. Ms. Vincent, Frank said, his voice even but unyielding, you need to come with me. Mara's eyes flicked to Caleb, cold and unblinking. You think you've won, she said, just loud enough for him to hear. You don't know what you've started. Caleb didn't reply. Instead, he watched as Frank guided her toward the side door where two uniformed officers waited. Rex, sensing the shift, stood abruptly and let out a sharp, deep bark that echoed against the wood-paneled walls. It wasn't aggressive, more a pronouncement, a clear signal that the threat was being removed. The sound drew a ripple of relieved smiles and even a few chuckles from the gallery. Lily's eyes brightened and she leaned down to whisper, "Good boy, Rex." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. As Mara was escorted out, some of the townsfolk in attendance, ranchers, shopkeepers, old classmates of Caroline, exchanged glances heavy with unspoken judgment. Many had heard rumors over the years but never seen proof. Now the truth was public. Judge Ellison rapped his gavel lightly. This hearing is concluded. Mr. Hayes, you may take your daughter home. Outside, the winter air felt sharper, cleaner. The three of them stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting the reality settle in. Caleb glanced at Marcus Dean, who stood nearby collecting his briefcase. The attorney gave him a rare, broad smile. Not bad for 2 days' work, Marcus said. Now the real part begins, making sure she can't touch either of you again. Caleb nodded. I'm ready for that fight. Rex shifted closer to Lily, who crouched to wrap her arms around his neck. Can we go home now? She asked. Yeah, Caleb said, resting a hand on her shoulder. Let's go home. They walked toward the truck together, Rex leading with his head high, the low winter sun casting their long shadows across the snow-dusted sidewalk. Winter in Mountain Hollow lingered longer than most places. By early February, the snow still lay thick across the fields, though the days were finally stretching a little longer. The old farmhouse at the end of the gravel road no longer looked like the abandoned relic Caleb had first set foot in. Its roof had been repaired, the porch boards replaced, and warm light spilled from the windows each evening, casting a golden glow over the snowdrifts. Inside, the living room had been transformed. The sagging couch was gone, replaced by a sturdy second-hand sofa draped with a quilt Mrs. Lucy had sewn herself. A wood-burning stove kept the air comfortably warm, its steady crackle a new heartbeat for the home. The walls, once dulled by years of neglect, now held framed photographs. Some of Caroline in her younger years, some of Lily smiling shyly, and one of Rex sprawled in the grass, tongue lolling in the summer sun. Caleb had thrown himself into the work of making the house theirs. His hands, calloused from years of police work and farm chores, were raw from sanding floors and patching walls, but there was satisfaction in every nail driven and every coat of paint applied. He found joy in small things, fixing a squeaky door so Lily could sleep without being startled, building a low bookshelf for the collection of worn children's books that had survived in the attic. Lily had changed too. She was still small for her age, her frame delicate, but her cheeks now carried a healthy color, and her laughter, once rare, now rang through the rooms. Every morning she would put on her navy coat, a wool scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, and Caleb would drive her into town for school. At first she'd been quiet, hesitant to speak to her classmates, but within weeks she had found a friend in Emma Price, a red-haired girl with a mischievous grin and a habit of sharing her lunch cookies. Rex had adapted easily to his new role as guardian of the homestead. He patrolled the property with the same diligence he'd shown in service, trotting the fence lines each morning and evening. When Caleb was working outside, Rex would often be found romping in the snow with Lily, their play punctuated by her squeals of delight. At night, he stationed himself in the corner of Lily's bedroom, head resting on his paws but eyes always half open, ears twitching at the slightest sound. More than once, Caleb had peeked in to find Lily asleep with her hand resting on his thick fur, her breathing even and peaceful. One bright but cold Saturday, Caleb told Lily they had somewhere important to go. She bundled up without complaint, curious, while Rex trotted to the door as if he already knew. They drove out of town, the road winding toward the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley. Snow crunched under their boots as they walked between the rows of stones until they stopped at a simple granite marker, Caroline Thompson. Lily stood for a long moment, her mittened hands clasped in front of her. Caleb kept a respectful distance, letting her have the space. Rex sat beside her, tail curled around his paws. Finally, Lily crouched down, brushing a bit of snow from the base of the stone. Her voice was soft but clear. "Meoi," she whispered. "Con tim te boroi. Vaka Rex nua. Con cum con so high nua." Caleb swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. He stepped forward, resting a hand on Lily's shoulder. "She'd be proud of you," he said quietly. Lily nodded, leaning briefly against him before standing and slipping her hand into his. The three of them walked back to the truck in silence, the winter sun low on the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Back at the farmhouse that evening, Caleb lit the stove while Lily fed Rex his dinner. Later, they sat together on the sofa, Lily reading aloud from one of her books, Rex stretched out at their feet, the stove casting flickering light across the room. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the kind of peace he'd thought he'd lost forever. The house no longer felt haunted by absence. It was filled with presence, of love, of laughter, of a future worth building. And outside, under the blanket of snow, the land lay quiet, holding its own promise, that this would always be their home. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not sudden flashes of light or voices from the sky, but the quiet way God places people, and even loyal animals, in our path to guide us home. Caleb, Lily, and Rex's story is a reminder that God's timing is perfect, even when we cannot see the plan. In life, we may feel abandoned, forgotten, or trapped in hardship, but His love works through ordinary moments, unexpected meetings, and the steadfast faithfulness of those who refuse to give up on us. Just as God brought a father and daughter back together through the courage of a child and the loyalty of a dog, He can bring restoration and hope to your life, no matter how broken things seem. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe that love still wins. Leave a comment and tell us your thoughts, and if you believe God still works miracles, write Amen in the comments. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, hope, and second chances. May the Lord bless and protect everyone watching today.